Hi, welcome to this ESRA short movie on survey monitoring. My name is Brady Schouten, and today we're going to talk to colleagues of the University of Michigan. Brady West and James Wagner, research professors at the Institute for Social Research, will explain the dashboards that they are using. I will get a demo by Paul Burton, who is a lead statistician at the Survey Research Center of the university. So today's ESRA short movie session is about survey monitoring. I have two experts from the University of Michigan. Actually, it's the Survey Research Center at the Institute for Social Research at University of Michigan. Brady West and James Wagner, welcome.
Thanks, Barry.
And thanks for being willing to join this session. Brady and James both are research professors at the University of Michigan at these institutes that I mentioned. So the session on monitoring is, I guess, becoming more and more important with the pressure on survey cost, the rise of different modes of data collection, the ideas of responsive, adaptive designs, and so on and so on. And Brady and James have been involved in this, well, for maybe 15 years or so, and have published a lot of work in this area, also giving courses in this area. So I'm very happy that I can talk to you. So I know that Michigan uses dashboards for survey monitoring. So how far back are these monitoring dashboards? Are you using them for many years, or what's the history behind those?
Well, from my perspective, I first found out about dashboards when I was a graduate student in our program in survey and data science, and Bob Groves at the time was directing the National Survey for Family Growth, and he was putting hard copy printed papers of charts from monitoring daily production activities with the National Survey of Family Growth. He was literally hanging them up in an office and meeting with the survey director at that time of NSFG very early, sometimes in the morning, to go over these production charts and try to point out areas where it seemed like production wasn't performing as expected, or there were warning flags. He was monitoring a variety of paradata based on his article with Steve Heeringa on responsive survey design. And he was looking at, because the NSFG was a continuous data collection, he could look at how performance was relative to prior quarters of the data collection and see how things were going. And he would pinpoint very specific issues that were emerging in these printed charts. And eventually those printed charts became part of a larger set of Excel workbooks that the managers of the NSFG could easily reflect on, zoom in on specific charts very quickly. And we would be discussing those in weekly production meetings, and again, kind of pointing out where it seemed like current data collection activities weren't going exactly as expected, and we needed some kind of intervention or some kind of prioritization. So I kind of grew up learning about responsive survey design in that kind of environment, where every week we were monitoring these trends in paradata and then trying to make management decisions in response to what was happening when we would see those trends. But Bob was extremely dedicated to this monitoring activity. Like I said, many mornings would start very, very early, and that gave him time to really reflect on these charts before he got into his daily responsibilities, which included directing the Survey Research Center at that time. So
So you're referring to the Herringa Groves paper, so
yeah.
some 2005 or 2006, around that time. Was there
Yep.
a particular reason for sort of the growing interest in this at the time? What was sort of the main drive? What were the main drivers at the time?
Yeah, it was largely trying to maximize cost efficiency with the NSFG. This was a new cycle of the NSFG that University of Michigan had been awarded, and they were really trying to institute this idea of continuous interviewing and making the entire data collection more efficient. And so that really gave rise to that article with Steve. And this was really, from my perspective, this was Bob's effort to really put what was in that article into practice. And he really, he meant what he said, and he did what he planned to do or suggested that people do in that article. He really lived it every day. So And that's when I started working on the NSFG. But James may have other perspectives on that time and that process, but that's certainly where I got into it.
Yeah, my history started a little earlier than that. I started working in SRO in 2002. And at that time, a lot of the studies monitored using something called a field progress report, which was kind of a standardized report, but it was tabular. So it would summarize sort of how many interviews there were, how many hours of interviewer time had been expended, what was the response rate. And it would do a row for the overall study, and then it might have a row for each week. It might have a row for the different regions, but it was tabular. And a lot of the study directors here were really, experts in sort of taking those reports and kind of understanding where things were at. But, for me, it was difficult because reading tabular data, I think, is hard unless you have a lot of experience reading particular tables. Uh, around that time, when we started developing sort of a prototype dashboard, and I worked with Grant Benson, and we worked a lot on designing what the different charts should look like. I think it wasn't highly successful. It was slow in the early days. It was picking up a lot of data. So, if you ran a report, it might take a minute or so for the report to generate. But one of the things that it did was it exported the summary data that was created to create the dashboard, to create the figures, the graphs in the dashboard. And Bob actually exported the data from that early dashboard and then built his own dashboard using the summarized data. We did, maybe to jump backwards a little bit, there was a group of us that met for a year or so in 2003 or so, 2004, that to talk about how to do field work monitoring and really how to forecast the future, where things were headed. And we spent a lot of time looking at different approaches to that problem across different studies. I remember we had folks from the PSID, we had the NSFG, and all of that information then got put into sort of how could different studies monitor, and really forecasting was sort of at the forefront of the discussion at that point. And Bob had been doing a lot of complex modeling to kind of predict how many interviews you would get, how many hours you would expend, and that sort of thing. But a lot of ideas during that time got generated, and I think, we're still feeding off of a lot of the things that were developed during that time.
And you mentioned SRO, NSFG. Was the monitoring right from the start on multiple surveys? Or was it sort of started smaller and then grew, sort of expanded to other surveys? Because they interact, of course. The one survey could sort of affect another one in effort, budget, and also how did that go?
Yeah, I think it really was the NSFG that set the example. Everybody had kind of built their own tools for monitoring. As I said, there was this sort of tabular reports in the background that were the most common way for people to look at what was happening. But I think once people saw the value of what you could do when you looked on a regular basis at things as they developed, people started to emulate that more and more. And I think that's really sort of become the norm at this point. The studies that we run, a lot of them are ongoing studies, and they've actually developed over time. The large panel studies are a big part of what we do. And they've developed over time a set of tools to monitor that meet their very specific needs. That is, they're highly tailored to the specifics of the study. What we probably have less of are sort of generic dashboards that we would use across multiple projects. We do have some of that, but a lot of what we do is highly tailored.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I've worked on projects that have developed very custom, specialized Excel workbooks like the NSFG and the health and retirement study, but I've also worked on projects where the dashboard was implemented in an Our Shiny app. And we would refer to that Our Shiny app to make specific decisions for that particular project. Like the American Family Health Study was another project where we would regularly consult an Our Shiny app dashboard to make decisions about what to do, that week with the data collection. So I agree with James, like the projects here at the University of Michigan are so unique, each of the projects, that I'm not sure that a general purpose dashboard would fit the needs of each of these different projects. So each different project has kind of had its own dashboard that's grown up. And like James said, has been tailored to the needs of that specific project and what's of most concern to them with respect to monitoring the production.
So what was the sort of the intended audience of these dashboards at the beginning? Was it, you mentioned Bob Groves, but was it, so what level of detail would it go to even to interviewers or interviewer staffing, or what was the audience of this?
Initially, from my perspective, it was really the survey management team, the survey directors, production managers, who really wanted to see, again, what was happening with the production at the time. Wasn't necessarily wide open to everybody like on the field team, but definitely the production managers who needed to make decisions on a daily basis and provide the field staff with guidance. And a lot of those charts, I'll show an example a little bit later on, but a lot of those charts were at the level of the field researcher. So we could see exactly people who were struggling, people, who were doing better than and might serve as role models. And then that would allow the production managers to follow up with specific field researchers. But like, we wouldn't want to open that up to every single interviewer, because then they could point and say, yeah, look at so-and-so, like they're having a hard time. So it was really intended for the production managers and the study directors to make decisions on a weekly basis about how to allocate effort in the field, where it seemed like, costs were rising and things of that sort. So
Do you think that, starting to have much more close monitoring of the survey sort of also shaped the surveys in a way that they changed them, or that there were things that you started to learn or see that maybe you were not that much aware of, or that turned out more important, or you think it sort of changed the surveys as well?
I wouldn't say the actual substantive content of the surveys. We don't have a ton of ability and flexibility to change the actual survey content. I would say they have led to changes in the protocols that we use and interviewer training, and trying to understand areas where the field researchers tend to struggle in the field, especially in the context of a particular study. Again, like learning, what seems to be working, what seems to be a difficulty for a particular study and its protocols. So I think, this regular monitoring of these production dashboards has kind of pointed out pain points where we've made changes to the actual data collection protocol in response to constant challenges that have emerged from monitoring these kind of production metrics. So I think in that sense, protocols have changed, but they haven't really led to any kind of major substantive changes in the surveys.
Yeah. I think the sort of the rise of these sort of monitoring tools sort of was parallel to discussions about how to actually measure cost, response, and all that. I think at the same time there was a lot of questions about how to do this. You was there how did it change this thinking in these dashboards? Has sort of the content changed a lot over time? So if you would look now back to these early, sort of relatively early days, are you monitoring very different things now, or is it, how has it evolved?
I'd say a couple of things. So it's not that response rate totally ruled what we did, but in a sense, when we looked at those old FPRs, response rate was the critical quality measure, if you will. And even though we could look at some subgroups in those reports, I don't think that was a major focus. And I think we have really shifted our thinking, to look more at the quality of the response. That is, are we getting balanced response in some sense, or measuring against other proxy measures of non-response bias? Are we doing better? I think that's much more of a focus now than it was 20 years ago. The other thing that I think we've done is we've spent more time looking at measures of efficiency. We used to focus on, particular hours per interview type of measures, and I think we've spent more time looking at other measures of efficiency that, a lot of them are proxy measures, Barry, because the actual cost data flow at a slower rate, and are often difficult to assign to specific scenarios, let's say. So it makes it, we rely even sort of on proxy measures of cost still to help us make decisions, at least on a daily basis or on a less frequent basis.
And I would say initially when Bob was, writing his own Excel file and, thinking about some of these ideas, at least in the context of the National Survey of Family Growth, there were many, many, many production monitoring charts. I mean, we had to have an index and a table of contents that people could kind of sift through and say, okay, what's the key performance indicator that we really want to look at like today? And, oh, I saw this one thing in this one chart. And over time, I think there was a set of charts that production managers tended to look at most often. And I think what's happened is that in the context of a specific project, there aren't as many charts anymore. We've kind of whittled it down to the most important charts for that particular project, like James was saying, in an effort to increase efficiency in the context of that particular study's design. These are the most important charts that we want to be looking at. So in the early days, it was like, we should look at this chart and let's think about this and let's think about that. But over time, as we've continued to tailor the production tools to each project, it's really kind of whittled down to a set of essential charts that are most important for that project. So that's all part of that kind of customization that's happened over time, I think. So in some sense, the production monitoring has become more efficient itself. Whereas before we were kind of like browsing all these different charts and seeing if anything looked weird in this chart or that chart. Some charts just kind of fell out of date. And then we said, there not many people are looking at those for particular projects. So do we really need to take the programming time, the processing time to create all those charts, or should we just focus on a more reduced set? So that's been another kind of part of the evolution, I'd say.
I'd say one thing that we haven't been very good about is separating the signal from the noise, if you will. Just because there's a lot of variation and we don't always know if it's sort of the process variation that something's gone wrong, or is it some noise in the system? And so, making decisions, accounting for the noise, I think is a difficult issue.
So it was a bit of introduction. Let's see what the dashboards look like. So we'll get a demo by Paul Burton.
Okay, hello everyone. We're here with Paul Burton, who is a statistician lead in the University of Michigan Survey Research Operations Group. And in this particular role, he's been providing statistical support for the Health and Retirement Study, or HRS, as a part of SRO since 2015. And today he's going to walk us through some of the graphs and charts in the HRS dashboard that we use to help us make production decisions in a responsive design framework. So Paul's going to start with a couple of graphs and we'll offer some commentary about them. So here you go.
Thanks, Brady.
Yep.
The first thing we're going to look at today is predicted probabilities plotted from a propensity model looking at the chance of a completed interview at the next call attempt. And so what we've done here is we've taken those probabilities from the model and plotted them based upon some categorical variables that are important for production concerns. Across the x-axis, we have the amount of time the case has been in the field, and across the y-axis is the probability of the interview. The categorical variables that we've broken this down by are effort categories, moving from the green of 1 to 6 attempts to the red of 20 or more attempts. And the two panels represent cases that we have full name information for and cases that we don't. And what we can see here are some, pretty important for production. Is the first thing we notice is that a longer case has been in the field, the less likely we are to get an interview on the next attempt. The other conclusion we can draw from this is that cases with less attempts on them have a higher chance of interview, which makes intuitive sense. And then finally, we can conclude that it's very important to get full name and phone number information because we can see the probabilities on the right side are significantly higher across the board than the probabilities on the left side.
Yep, excellent. Yeah, so predicted probabilities based on good models are an essential component of responsive survey designs like this, especially in the HRS. So Okay, great.
And then the next graph we're going to look at is data from the same model, just plotted, with one different categorical variable. Across the x-axis, we have the amount of time the case has been in the field, and we can see as we move across that x-axis, the probability of success goes down. And again, in the left-hand panel, cases without a full name and phone number, and in the right panel, cases where we do, and we can see that we have a higher chance of getting the interview when we have that full name information. The thing we can glean from this is that the next category that we broke it down by were days since last attempt, which is a measure of the gap between attempts the case is seen. And what we can see is that as that delay goes longer, the chance of the interview goes down.
Right.
So our protocol should take that into account and try the case as often as possible where we can.
Right. Yep. So this is really helpful to provide the field interviewers with guidance about how they stagger their attempts and making sure that there's not too long of a gap between them. So, yep. Great.
So the next thing we're going to turn to is a little bit more concrete, and this is looking at the attempts per complete. And these attempts we're talking about here are across all modes. It's all contact modes. So it's quite aggregate. But what we're trying to do when we're looking at a graph like this is to see how we're doing this wave compared to previous waves, and to make sure that the protocols are producing interviews in the same sort of efficiency as they did in the past. And so we're looking here. We have the blue series with the yellow dots is the current production series, and the light green and the light red are past waves production. And we can see across as we move forward by production week, which is what the x-axis is, that while it's going up, it's also going up at the same rate, and not more so than we saw in previous waves. So we can conclude from this that our current protocols are as efficient in producing interviews as they were previously.
Yep, excellent. Yeah, so it's important to track that daily efficiency as a part of this type of data collection as well. Yep.
And then more on a sort of interviewer management point of view, we have this graph, which looks at the percent of admin hours billed by the interviewers per week. And just a brief explanation of that is that interviewers, when they bill their time, they bill it to different tasks, and some of these tasks are administrative in nature, such as going to meetings, filling out paperwork, things of that nature. And while those are necessary and we expect the interviewers to do those things, we also don't want that to be the bulk of the time that they're spending. We want them to be doing interviews. So what this does is looks at the percentage of their time billed to those administrative tasks over the project weeks, and compares it to the past waves. So this wave is the yellow line with the blue dots, and then we're comparing it again to the past waves and the green and the red. And we can see here that we are actually running a little bit more efficient as far as interviewers billing their time to administrative tasks in this wave.
Yep. So that's an essential component of this, as well as this reference to historical data and seeing how well we're doing to previous data collections with a very similar design to see if anything seems to be off. But this is also very important for interviewer guidance in terms of how they're portioning their time. So, yep. Great.
And lastly, we'll look at something that's a little bit more complicated, but very concrete about from production statistics, right? So what we see here is a graph that's showing two different things. One that it's showing how many attempts we've made in different call windows, and the other thing it's showing is the contact rate that we've gotten from those attempts. So the red bars represent how many attempts we've made during these different call windows, which are across the x-axis, and then the blue bars represent the contact rate. And what we can see here is that most of our attempts are being made during the Monday to Friday during the day call window. That is not our highest contact rate call window. This is to initial contact, so we're looking at the first contact with the respondent, but it's also not far off. There's not a ton of variation there. So, I don't think that this would make us change anything necessarily, but it is good to keep track of to make sure that we're not seeing a lot of variation, or we're not seeing a lot of calls in a call window we weren't expecting.
Right. So this is really important to see if interviewers are tending to make a ton of calls in a call window that's not very productive in terms of contact rates. And this kind of graph can be used to kind of retrain them on the fly and say, hey, it's be better, or maybe you haven't been making as many call attempts in this particular window where you might have a little bit higher probability of success. So very important to monitor this live during data collection as well. So great. Okay, well, thanks, Paul. That's just a little sample of some of the production dashboards that HRS uses. Paul's played a fundamental role in developing and interpreting all these for the HRS production managers, so we're very grateful for his time today in walking through these. So thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Brady.
Thanks.
Well, it was very interesting. Let's zoom out again and ask Brady and James a few more questions about the dashboards and how they think they're going to evolve in the coming years. Yeah, I can imagine that if you look at many numbers, as a statistician, there should always be something that you would see, even if it's coincidence in a way. But it's very hard to account for it because many of these numbers actually are correlated with each other. So we get to do sort of more to the content of the dashboard later on. So would you say that now you're a bit more, how would you say, conservative, or are there charts that in the past you would say, well, if they signal something, we do something, but now you've learned that there is this sort of dynamics in there?
I think we've learned that you don't want to try to address too many problems at once. If you try to layer multiple live interventions in the data collection protocol on top of each other, inevitably it leads to confusion among field researchers, and one part of the intervention that you wanted to implement may not get implemented as well as you would have liked, and maybe another part gets more attention from the field researchers. So basically the way I think we approach it now is we kind of look at the problem of the day and say what's standing out as like the biggest single issue right now that we need to address, and is there some kind of intervention like that we need to address, that we need to implement in isolation, not on top of two other interventions that are all happening at the same time. Because if we make a change to the data collection protocol in response to what we're seeing in these kind of production monitoring charts, that all has to be communicated. The field staff all have to be aware of exactly what needs to change in the operation. There might be something in the sample management system that's a flag that they have to now look at, and all of that needs to be clear, or the intervention's simply not going to work. So although it may look like multiple things are going on that need to be addressed, usually it's trying to attack what seems to be the biggest issue for this particular point in time, and making sure not to layer too many changes to the protocol on top of each other, because in our experience, we've found that really backfires. And if you have multiple interventions going at the same time, they kind of cancel each other out, and neither of them work. So I think that's one lesson that we've taken away.
So I guess in the same sort of time frame that we're talking about, also sort of moved a bit away from fully interviewer assisted to more mixing of modes. That gives you very different kind of patterns, also different kind of paradata and all that. Has these migrations to other modes also changed the dashboards? How do you actually mix all of these different modes into one overarching view?
I mean, I think one cool thing that our programmers and our analysts have worked out is a way to toggle the dashboard to show what's happening for a particular mode that we might be using. So at a phase of the design, if people are getting a lot of mail or whatever the case may be, we can see what's happening with response, say, to mailed invitations, or toggle and say what's happening with response to people who are getting an invitation to complete by web. And like James was saying earlier, like, are there differences among subgroups in terms of how they're reacting to the use of that particular mode? And that really helps us, like, thinking about adaptive design, is if it seems like some subgroups have a better reception to a particular mode, then we can think about in a future replicate sample, okay, maybe we start with that mode for that particular subgroup and see how we do there. But I think that kind of assessment of subgroup variability, also crossed with what mode they're currently working with, has provided a lot of insight, I think, that's helped with adaptive design thinking. So, and yeah, no, that's the ability to toggle and see what's happening when different modes are being used, I think, has been a really cool tool that's helped us to think about optimal assignment of these different strategies to cases. So, and James, yeah, feel free to add to that.
Let's say I'm the U of M PI here on a big panel study where we release the sample and we call it replicates. So we have about 14,000 units in our sample and we release 1,200 a month. Basically, and then we do that interviewing over 18 months, and the modes are offered in phases. So we start with web, we go to telephone, and so we have kind of a baseline we can look at over time. Are we getting consistent results? So we would know, we don't shut off the web mode at any point. So there's always that possibility, but we do expect consistent results over time. I think the shift for us has really been to, self-response modes. I think that's pretty common. A lot of us in this field are experiencing that. And I think that's kind of forced us to think about what do we monitor in a web survey like the one that I'm the PI here for, where a lot of our communications are through email. And so we've been looking for ways in which we monitor, are those emails leading, are we seeing differences across different email servers in the US, different companies that offer email? Because we suspect that we can get our emails blocked by different servers depending upon how our email is set up here. So we've been looking for new ways to monitor our communications towards respondents, and then how are they coming back to us? It's more complicated in this setting because when we send out 3 emails, a letter, and then we make some telephone calls, sometimes it's difficult to know which of those is having the impact that we see, right? Is that telephone call leading to an interview, even though we never spoke to someone? So we started to raise more difficult questions that I think probably require some real experimentation to understand how those modes interact.
And this is where visualization has been so helpful. So like I'll name Wen Cheng. She's another excellent analyst that we've been working with, and she helped to develop the our Shiny dashboard for the American Family Health Study. And along the lines of what James was saying, you try these different reminder protocols in the different phases of the design. And Wen was able to produce some charts that would show, okay, here's where we had this reminder, here's where we had this reminder, here's where we had this reminder. And then you could see what was happening to yield and production in response to each of those reminders. And you could break that down by mode as well. And so that kind of chart's really helpful for saying, oh, do we really need this third reminder, this fourth reminder? Are the reminders more important in the mail phase as opposed to the push to web phase? Like being able to visualize that was extremely helpful, because then if you do have your design broken into replicates, like James was saying, you can say, okay, for this particular phase, it looks like we only need 2 reminders, and then you can implement that in the next replicate and try to converge to kind of an optimal protocol by the time that you're releasing your last sample replicate. So being able to visualize those kinds of effects, especially in this mixed mode context, has been incredibly helpful. And the R Shiny dashboards have made it very easy to do that. So
Yeah, so we've been talking quite a bit about sort of the origins of the dashboard, but maybe it's also good to talk a bit more about what's in there. You mentioned that some indicators are more important than others. So maybe even though the surveys are different in this way, there's a specific context to every study that you're doing. Could you give a bit of a description of what you think are the most important indicators that you would look at, or that you think that have been most important over the years?
yeah, I'll start with that. I think one that has proven to be extremely valuable is a heat map of the best times of day to try to make contact, to help interviewers channel their efforts, or the best general segments of the week where contact is most likely, or where contacts are most productive. The interviewers are often looking for guidance in terms of, are there particular calling windows that I haven't hit, or that, we've missed, or, should I be using a different calling strategy than what I'm currently using? And based on the real production data, we can look broken down by areas of the sample, or broken down by other characteristics of those areas. See, if you look at a heat map of kind of time of day versus day of week, what are the most productive cells in terms of likelihood of making contact? Or what are the cells where most contacts are going to result in an appointment? So we can look at the diversity across different types of areas, different regions of the United States. Some weekdays, some times of the weekdays may be better in some regions than others. And then we can communicate that information back to the interviewers and say, make sure you're making some calling efforts within these particular windows. And then that will increase the general efficiency of the calling efforts that the interviewers are making. So that kind of heat mapping idea based on real production data to help steer the efforts of the interviewers and make sure that they're hitting all the most productive calling windows has been one I think that's benefited multiple projects that are using interviewers in the field still. So that's an example that's very specific to an interviewer administered data collection, but it's one I think that's proven very valuable. And you can kind of hit that sweet spot and say, okay, if you're going to make any calls this week, make sure it's on a weekend during the day or whatever the case may be. Because again, for a specific study population, like in the health and retirement study, people age 50 and above, there may be specific calling windows in particular areas that are going to be most productive. And thorough analyses of the production data will really shed light on that. And I think that helps the field staff be more efficient. So that's just one example that I've seen that has benefited multiple studies. And I'm sure James has some others. So.
Yeah, I was going to go back to kind of a more general view, which, came from Bob, which is sort of always in the back of my head, is just thinking about sort of, I would say, 4 categories of things that we monitor. And it starts from inputs and outputs. So inputs are the things that we control that we put into the production process, and the outputs are the things that we get out. But within each of those, we also look at quantity and quality. So what's the quantity of the input and what's the quality of the input? And the same on the output side. What's the quantity of the output and what's the quality of that output? And thinking about it that way, it's really helped me over the years to think about what are the gaps in what we're monitoring and making sure that we're looking at all of the things that we control and the things that we don't exactly control, but we want to know about. So just some examples. I think on the input side, the quantity of the inputs, the things that we look for are things like hours, the number of attempts, right? And so those are, in a way, they're proxies, but I think they're useful proxies that help us understand, are we getting enough of those things in order to complete the task at hand? We also look at quality, and on the input side, most of our quality measures really are efficiency kind of measures. So are we getting a particular hours per interview ratio? That is one we have specified, which is a measure of efficiency. How many hours does it take to produce one interview? I mean, I suppose you could flip that and say, how many interviews are we getting each hour? But we don't typically see that ratio. So we're not usually on that end of the efficiency. Or we could also look at calls per interview as an efficiency measure, just to see, following up on that notion that Brady was talking about, that, what can we do to help our interviewers be as efficient as possible? On the output side, again, I think it's the same quantity and quality. Are we getting the interviews? When we were doing the NSFG, we looked at screening as a point in production, and we wanted to know how many households we had screened for eligibility as a kind of an output of the process. But we also looked at quality, and I think that's our big expansion area. So it could be sample balance measures, for example, the R indicator, something that we use. Barry, thank you. Subgroup response rates have been a big thing for us over the years. The coefficient of variation of those subgroup response rates has been something that we monitor. And I think too, measurement error is something that we've looked at to see, are we seeing indications, I would say proxy indications, somebody going very quickly through the survey. Those kind of measures also have been something that we look at as a quality measure. And I think those have really grown in importance for us. So that allows us to say, realign our effort towards particular subgroups that are responding at lower rates, or to talk to interviewers who are going very quickly through interviews on average, and we want to see if there's something we can do to help them, slow down and make sure that they aren't inducing measurement error with their pace. On the efficiency side, I think it's that's probably the tougher one, because in most of our surveys, interviewers have different sample. And the sample that they have different characteristics. And so knowing what's the correct or optimal efficiency for any given interviewer is difficult to know. But we do try to monitor those things carefully and then intervene in ways that make sense. That is, to understand first what are the problems that each interviewer faces, and then help them improve their practice so that they can be more efficient if possible.
Yeah.
How do you make this sort of transition from overarching higher level indications to all the way down to the interviewer level, which is really almost like micro level in a way? There is some sort of transition between it. How do you do this? Is this
Yeah, we again, with the help of Bob, have looked at the development of these propensity adjusted performance metrics for interviewers to get a sense of the interviewer variability, but also recognizing that some interviewers may have more difficult workloads than others. So I think that's been another consistent theme of the dashboard monitoring with regard to interviewer performance, is not to just, base our evaluation of interviewers on how many interviews they've completed or what their response rate is or whatever the case may be, but how are they doing relative to model-based expectations of how they should be doing? So if we're predicting response propensity to motivate all other kinds of, responsive design ideas, we also have these predictions of response propensity at the next attempt, at the next contact, and so forth and so on. Predictions that they're going to find an eligible person within a particular household. We can see how they're doing at a given call relative to that predicted probability of having success, and then aggregate those deviations between what actually happens and what was predicted to happen. We can aggregate that across all of the attempts that they're making and see where particular interviewers might stand out. And again, this is kind of a heat mapping idea. And Barry, I can share, would you like me to share that dashboard?
yeah, that I think that gives a good impression. Yeah,
Okay.
please.
Let me share this real quick. So this is just an example of what we call the interviewer performance profile. And this is the heat mapping idea that I was referring to previously, where you can see that each row of this particular matrix is one interviewer. So we don't have particular names here, but each row is one interviewer. And then you can see all these kind of performance metrics that along the different columns. And everywhere that you see PAIP indicators, these are these propensity adjusted interviewer performance indicators. And we've heat mapped all of these results, where a green means that an interviewer is doing really well relative to expectations. A yellow basically means they're right near the average, right where we expect them to be. And then a red or a dark red means that they're really struggling relative to what their expectations are. And what this type of approach does is it allows the production managers to go in, find an interviewer who's consistently in the dark red on these propensity adjusted performance metrics, and then follow up with that interviewer about that particular aspect where they're struggling. So for example, you see this PAIP eligibility rates. If an interviewer has a bright red there and they're in the negative, that means their achieved eligibility rate is generally much lower than what would have been predicted based on our models of eligibility. So it really seems like they're struggling to find an eligible person when they're doing screening. And we can follow up with that particular part of the process for that particular survey, depending on what the eligibility criteria are. And another part of this performance metric, like James was saying, measurement error. So we have these data quality indicators that are based on keystroke data from the actual survey data collection when the interviewers are entering information. And you can see if some interviewers are getting too many errors, or they're suppressing too many errors, or they're collecting too many don't know responses to the individual survey questions. Those two are showing up in this heat map. And what that allows production managers to do is intervene, for example, with this interviewer who's collecting far more than expected don't know or refusal responses to the survey items, and go through that process where it seems like they're tending to collect don't know responses too often, and maybe do some live retraining to make sure that whatever behavior is resulting in that metric is being curbed. So in that way, we can manage at the level of the field researcher and try to nip any problems in the bud, where if this interviewer had just persisted in this way for the entire data collection, it would have ultimately been a problem with data quality for all the interviews that they completed. And we want to try to nip that in the bud. And then there are also specific observations that are collected in each of our different studies. And we want to see if, for a given interviewer, if there are big gaps in terms of what they're observing for respondents and what they're observing for non-respondents, meaning that they're tending to complete interviews with a certain type of individual, resulting in a lack of sample balance. So again, we can heat map that and say, well, interviewer 9, it seems like you're completing interviews with people with these characteristics based on your observations far more often than you're completing interviews with people who don't have that characteristic. And so that kind of heat map says, the interviews that you're completing are contributing to a lack of sample balance. And again, we don't have to intervene with everybody. We can just revisit certain aspects of the protocol with that particular interviewer based on this kind of overall performance profile. And the heat mapping idea, there's a ton of numbers here. The heat mapping idea allows the production managers to zoom right in and see where the pain points are, and then intervene appropriately with that particular interviewer depending on the metric. So we've found this to be incredibly helpful, especially in these interviewer-administered data collections, to, again, try to increase efficiency, try to make sure they're introducing balance that's good for that particular project. And again, this is why we have to have these kinds of customized dashboards for each of our different projects. So that's kind of how we kind of hone in and zoom in on the specific features of a given project, in addition just to the standard performance indicators like you see on the left here, like hours, like James was saying, HPI, response rates, all the standard stuff that's usually monitored. But we like to add on these other model-based performance metrics and make sure that they're achieving balance in those as well. So I'll stop sharing this for now.
Yeah, it's a great example.
Yeah.
But maybe going back to this one question. So here you're relatively low, well, high detail. You're already at the interviewer level. So
Yep.
imagine that in a particular area of the country or a particular city, or maybe young people, you find, well, we're not doing very well on those sort of subpopulations. How would you sort of translate that to these sort of more micro information? Would you say, well, interviewers in that area, or interviewers having relatively a lot of young people in a way? How would you go about that?
I mean, the approach I would take, and I'd be curious to hear James's thoughts as well, is I would identify interviewers who are having success with that particular population. They may not be from that area, but interviewers who tend to have higher response rates for that particular population, and then pick their brains as opposed to what strategies they're using, what approaches they're taking. Like maybe there's something about the survey that they tend to emphasize. So we like to try to find the interviewers who are having a lot of success on a particular aspect of the study. Maybe it's for a hard to reach or a low response rate subgroup of the overall study. We try to find an interviewer who's doing relatively better with that subgroup, and then learn a little bit from them. And that kind of empowers those interviewers as well. It's just, hey, we really respect what you're doing. It seems like you're doing really well with this particular subgroup. Can we ask you a little bit about the strategies that you're using, and share some of your advice and your strategies with other interviewers who might be having a more difficult time? And that might result in a general recommendation to the entire field staff that says, hey, try these strategies with this particular subgroup, and that might help us to bring up that response rate a little bit. But trying to get information from the interviewers, I think it gives them a good chance to feel like they're actually contributing more to the protocols that are being used, and their strategies and their efforts are being valued. So I think there's kind of a win-win in that situation, to learn from the best performing interviewers for a particular subgroup, but also give them the ability to have a word in what we're doing. So I think that's been a very positive thing. So, but yeah, I'd be curious to hear James's thoughts as well.
Yeah, so the first thing is that, my focus tends to be overall or a national level estimate, depending upon the study, sort of, are there, at that level, are there imbalances occurring that we need to address? And then we can develop interventions that are going to help us with those imbalances, which might be prioritization, it might be use of a stopping rule, it might be something else, but nevertheless, we want to try and address those imbalances at a national level. I think it's a little harder at the interviewer level, and I think I'm saying just in a different way what Brady was just saying, but there it's hard for us to know what's noise and what's signal, right? And that's where that interaction between an interviewer and their immediate supervisor, here we call that person a team leader, is important, right? Because it can be a conversation, right? They can start to separate the noise from the signal in at that level, right? In a way that I can't do with each interviewer. And so those conversations and that mentoring, if you will, that the supervisor to that interviewer provides can be very helpful in addressing, what could be an issue. So we have some examples where interviewers were reading questions too quickly, and an intervention from a team leader who asks about what's happening, reminds them about rules of interviewing, can change that behavior. And other examples where there's something else happening underneath the hood, and we need that sort of micro level information to help us distinguish, is this noise or is this signal? And so that's I think the different levels of management play a role in sort of implementing interventions appropriate for that level.
Like one other example of that, we found in one case, particular interviewers were suppressing error messages. Like we could see this in the keystrokes, that an error would come up with a value that they enter for a question, but they would just suppress that and escape out of that error message and then just proceed with the next survey questions. And they were doing this consistently. So they were entering something that maybe was failing an edit check or something like that, but then they were suppressing that error. And when we intervened and reminded them that, that error means that something you've entered is not compatible in some way, that really curbed that behavior. And that was a kind of measurement error that would have persisted if we had not intervened after seeing that in the keystroke data. And again, very specific to a particular study, but I think the ability to do that, the interviewers also appreciate that. They say, oh, I'm sorry, like I wasn't realizing that I was causing a big problem there. And if you can catch that live in the middle of a data collection, is not going to persist and ultimately contaminate all the data that an interviewer is collecting. So, but I agree with James. It's also important to think about like what's happening big picture. It's just that some interviewers can play a huge role in what's happening in the big picture if they're deviating from the protocols or the procedures that we want them to use. So, especially if they have bigger workloads. So.
Okay, well, we have also seen great examples by your lead statistician, Paul Burton. Give good ideas of what the dashboard may look like.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a bit more practical kind of question. So I know in the States it's studies. There's of course the stakeholders. They are important for you. What kind of role do they have in this dashboard? Do you communicate dashboard results with them? How is this sort of organizationally? Are they just letting you go, or is there a very frequent communication with them about what you're observing?
That's a good question. I would say in my experience, most of that, in-depth work with the dashboards, review of the dashboards, what exactly we want to monitor and so forth, that's been very internal to the study team. I think the sponsors, the funders, the stakeholders, who are supporting this particular research, they're going to assume that we're using production monitoring tools that we outlined in a research proposal or a contract bid, and they're going to hold us to our word that we're actually doing that to make the data collection more efficient. But I don't think there's a ton of interest in them getting their hands on going over these dashboards and seeing exactly what we're doing. I think for the most part, they're going to assume that we know what we're doing and we have a plan to use these dashboards to make production more efficient. And certainly if they're unhappy with efficiency or production seems to be waning, they may want big picture explanations for what might be going on. And then we'll take the dashboard charts and use those to demonstrate, these are the challenges that we're having in the field right now that are preventing us from hitting particular targets or particular goals. Like, for example, in the health and retirement study right now, we're just having a very hard time getting the interviewers to put in the hours that they committed to. And we can show a graph that says, here are the actual hours worked by week, and here's what the target number of hours should have been based on their initial commitments when they signed onto the project. So we'll pull that out of the dashboard and then share that with the stakeholders to say, here's a reason why we might be struggling in terms of hitting a particular yield goal right now, or whatever the case may be. But I think in terms of the complexities, the day-to-day operations, the stakeholders really just want to know big picture what some of the major issues are, if any issues are arising. And most of the management, assessment, evaluation, decisions about these dashboards are very much made internally based on what we think are the best approaches. So.
Okay, so you could say there's in a way it's a bit of internal. They trust you on this, but
Yes.
do you use it to motivate sort of larger interventions or changes in budget? Or you would say, well, you can see certain charts are going well worse over time. Very good example, I guess, is Corona.
Yep.
Does it play a role in communicating interventions or larger changes?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if we're making a large protocol change to an overall data collection that was motivated by evidence from these production dashboards, certainly we'll say that these are the charts, these are the data that we're basing this major sea change on. Trying to implement a new mode or something like that. We're seeing that, face-to-face data collection kind of hits a peak at this point. We might want to try using a different mode, and we'll provide the necessary charts extracted from the dashboard just to support those decisions if we are making them. But yes, there are many cases where what we've learned from regular production monitoring has modified the protocol in sometimes very significant fashions. So, like for example, right now the HRS is looking to implement the use of the web for baseline data collection, new cohort recruitment for the first time in its history, just because of the challenges with the face-to-face recruitment right now. So, and that's all been apparent from multiple dashboard charts. So, and James may have other examples as well.
Yeah, so I think in general, our dashboards could contain information that needs to remain secure and confidential. So for instance, you saw that sort of the interviewer identities, we had blocked them out of the graph that Brady showed a minute ago. But we see them internally because we need that information internally for monitoring purposes. Sometimes the location of sample is used in monitoring. We use GIS and maps to help us monitor what's happening regionally. And that information has to be blocked to external stakeholders. And so we don't generally make dashboards available, but we have made sort of approved versions of our dashboards externally available at times. The study I was talking about a minute ago, the panel study, we actually we have a PI dashboard. We PDF it on a weekly basis. That is, we turn all the reports into a single long PDF, and we send it to the external stakeholders as a way for them to have that information. I think more commonly we do what Brady was describing, which is we take the information that we're monitoring and we put it into presentations that we make to stakeholders, whether it could be at a conference, or it could be at more likely meetings with the stakeholders where they want to know what progress has been made and what issues we're facing. And we present it to them in that, carefully curated environment where we've made the choices about what can be shown.
I guess in this area, benchmarking or knowing what to expect is important. So can you sort of look in over time, if you look back a number of years, okay, that's where we were at that time, now it's where we are. Does it affect your benchmark in a sense what you like to achieve? Or
yeah, I think a regular feature of the production monitoring charts that we have in our dashboards nowadays, especially like James was saying earlier in the context of using replicate samples, is to display what prior samples were doing in terms of a key performance indicator as the data collection proceeded, and then overlay what's happening in the current sample against those prior trends for your previous replicate samples to see, are we in line with what we would expect based on historical trends or does it seem like the current replicate might be deviating in terms of some particular performance indicator maybe coming in lower than expected? Then we can address that particular issue. Like a really interesting one is concerns that survey respondents express about the nature of the survey request. Like, is this coming from the government, or, I don't have enough time, I'm not home enough, whatever. If you look at historical trends in those concerns, you can see a lot of variability in terms of how often those concerns are expressed. So that allows us to tailor the reactions of the interviewers to these particular concerns, or give the interviewers something to work with if concerns about, providing data to the government are coming in at a higher than expected rate based on previous historical benchmarks. Could be what's happening in politics at that point in time, or whatever the case may be. And then we can arm the interviewers with, good responses to some of those concerns that we're seeing pop up more often in the field. So yeah, constant benchmarking is a key part of all these production monitoring charts to see how we're doing relative to expectations, like I said, based on the propensity adjustments, how we're doing relative to past sample replicates. That's a very, very useful tool in my view to try to understand what's happening like right now in real time. So.
Mhm.
I would just add that sometimes for a survey that's a one-time cross-sectional survey, we would have managers create projections of what they expect to happen. So let's say how many interviews will be collected each day or each week, as some way to measure some expectation of how we're doing. Sort of like using an expert to help us determine what we think should be sort of the milestones we should achieve over time.
Well, in Europe, I would say since sort of post-corona, there has been a growing concern, especially in the interviewer areas. During corona, a lot of interviewers sort of stopped interviewing, and very hard to get these workforces back again when corona was over. So in many countries, it's just harder, and that has also affected interviewer monitoring because you can't maybe expect as much as we did before. How is this in the US? Do you have the same kind of experiences that it's that's a different survey climate right now?
Yeah, I think James was leading a task force actually that we've had working here at the Survey Research Center to try to understand, what's happening with interviewer retention and engagement across all the different projects that we're working on here at SRC. So a lot of us have been working very hard on that. But during the height of the COVID pandemic, we did lose a lot of field staff from different projects, and the rebound from that has not been as solid as we would have liked, and it's becoming much harder to retain and keep interviewers engaged, especially those who are contingent employees, like working on a part-time basis. So I think we've had a very similar effect here. I think the concerns about the specific virus are fewer than they were with respect to in-person work. It's just a lot of other jobs on a part-time basis can be very competitive with survey interviewing, given how much we're asking the survey interviewers to do. So, interviewers have a hard time. They're finding many challenges in the field. They look at other part-time jobs and they say, well, why am I going through all these difficulties and these challenges? Like I could, achieve the same wage and work the same hours at a different job where I don't have to have somebody like slamming the door in my face, or like, setting dogs on me, or, having to worry about like all these physical measurements and things like that. So I think it's a big challenge. And I think there's a lot of different groups working on, what we might be doing differently with the labor model for interviewers right now to, make them feel a stronger part of organizations, like reward them more for the very difficult work that they're doing. But yeah, it's been a definite change since the pandemic, and I think it's become a lot more hard to keep and engage and maintain high quality interviewers, to be sure. So
Yeah, so the only thing I'd add, Gary, is that I guess I'd say we've experienced the same thing. I think we're unsure whether this is a permanent change. Or not. I mean, that's a big question. It does appear that the attrition rates, the rate at which interviewers leave before the survey is complete, let's say, that's gone down in the most recent past. But we'll see, that could be noise, right? That's one of those questions that's still, I think, an open question. Have we experienced a permanent change in the structure of the labor force for interviewing, or was it really kind of an artifact of this, the COVID era and the immediate period after that?
It hasn't really changed the way you use the dashboards or the way you look at it. It's maybe a little bit more uncertain time period right now. So
Yeah, I mean, all the stuff we've been talking about with the dashboards assume that you have this stable, hardworking core of interviewers.
yeah,
Like what we're really talking about right now is just bringing the interviewers into a project to begin with, and then making sure that they stay on that project. It hasn't really changed how we approach the dashboards. It's a different challenge, just trying to recruit them, train them, and then make sure that they stay engaged and that they're valued employees working on that particular project. So. But yeah, that hasn't really had a big impact on how we approach the dashboards, no.
Well, I have one final question. So if you look a little bit to the future, would you say that you're missing certain kind of indicators, or that you would say we should look more into this kind of phenomena that has changed?
Yeah,
What would you predict for the coming years? Will you keep the dashboards as they are, or will you change them? Or
I think, yeah, we definitely want to try to hone in on what works best for a given data collection. So I think a lot of what we have operating right now, like some of the stuff Paul was demonstrating, works very well. And I think we'll keep a lot of what we have. But I do think there are new measures of data quality that are coming out that I think trying to monitor trends in those measures and maybe react to some of those measures is a new way to go for sure. We've been experimenting with using measures of importance and measures of influence on survey estimates in the health and retirement study, and trying to prioritize cases that are expected to have a large influence on, the ultimate survey estimate that would be computed, and then, looking at experiment that prioritizes those kinds of cases and seeing what impact that has on our overall estimates. And then in the bigger picture, like James was saying, if you look at the full sample, does it seem like there's evidence of certain types of selection bias emerging if you end up seeing variability in response rates? Like the idea of looking at variability among subgroups in response rates is important, but that assumes that those subgroups also vary in terms of the key variables that you're trying to measure. So looking at survey estimates and seeing whether there's evidence of bias emerging in those estimates that would warrant some kind of intervention on particular subgroups, I think that's where some of the monitoring needs to go, is thinking about, the overall quality of the estimates that would be produced here. And I think these measures of influence that Westat has done a lot of really nice work on, and then some of these new measures of selection bias that are coming out in the literature, I think real-time monitoring of those measures and real-time monitoring of interviewer variance, kind of like I talked about in the performance profile, I think that's going to be a key aspect of the dashboards moving forward. So.
I guess a couple of things that I would point to. First, I think with the increase in self-response modes, I think we need to think about how we monitor the communications that are going out. So email communications. So how do we monitor? Can we tell open rates, for example? Can we know if emails were blocked by email services, right? So those kind of questions, I think, are important in understanding our outgoing communication and knowing whether or not it's going to be successful. The other thing that I think is important, something I talked a little bit about earlier, is just in this mixed mode environment, what are the things that we do that are effective and what are the things that we do that are ineffective? So if we're communicating in multiple modes, asking respondents to do a web survey, let's say, and which of those communications are effective? Now, 10 years ago, we did some experimentation to see if and others have done this as well, to say that multiple modes of outgoing communication are effective compared to a single mode of communication. But I don't know that we know enough to really make the day-to-day decisions about, is this next phone call going to be helpful? Is it worth the cost that we're investing in this effort in order to justify it? And I think we need more evidence on that kind of thing. And dashboards can get us part of the way there. I think we also need, experimentation to help us make some of those decisions.
Okay, great. It's good to know that there's still something that we can do in the future to change or to revise. So I also like to point the listeners to this short movie in many of your papers that you've been producing over the years. We haven't talked too much about survey cost, but you've done a lot of work on that as well. So thanks a lot for joining this session and giving some insights on what you're doing and how. So looking forward to see you at ESRA conference, maybe in The Hague next year. So thanks a lot.
Yes, thanks, Barry. This has been very fun. Yep.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's been great.
Well, that's it for this ESRA short movie on survey monitoring. I hope you enjoyed it and, like me, learned from our colleagues of University of Michigan. Please also look at the other ESRA movies that you can find at esra.org.